The galaxy far, far away had seen empires rise and fall, had witnessed the death of stars and the birth of legends. It had endured the Clone Wars, survived the rise of the Emperor, and weathered the destruction of an entire planet at the hands of a battle station the size of a moon. The Force, that invisible and eternal current binding all living things, had seen much, but even the Force could not have anticipated what tore through the fabric of space above Coruscant on that particular morning, a wound in reality itself, a screaming rent in the dimensional membrane that spilled light of entirely the wrong color across the upper atmosphere of the Imperial throne world. It lasted 11 seconds. Then it was gone, and in its wake, tumbling through the ionosphere at catastrophic speed, was a ship that matched no Imperial registry, no rebel manifest, no bounty hunter schematic on record. Sleek, grey, twin-engine, built for a world that had never heard the shriek of a TIE fighter or felt the shadow of a Star Destroyer. The Quinjet. Inside, 6 people were having what Tony Stark would later describe as the single worst Tuesday of my life, and I have fought a purple alien with a magic glove. Friday, talk to me. Tony's voice was clipped and controlled. The way it always got when controlled was the only thing standing between him and full-scale panic. The heads-up display inside the Mark L flickered, struggling to parse sensor data that simply didn't compute. Energy signatures it had no baseline for. Gravitational readings from a planet whose profile wasn't in any database on Earth. Because it wasn't on Earth. Because they weren't anywhere near Earth. Dimensional displacement confirmed. Friday responded, her voice carrying that particular tone she reserved for situations Tony had always insisted were impossible. Quantum tunnel collapse pulled us through. Current location, unknown. Atmosphere composition breathable. Gravity nominal. And Mr. Stark, we have incoming. They hit the viewport at the same moment. All 6 of them. Below, a planet of pure city. No oceans. No wilderness. No horizon that wasn't made of durasteel and transparasteel. And towers that climbed so high they punched through the cloud layer into open space. Lights blanketed every visible surface like a second layer of stars. Skylanes, actual aerial traffic lanes, organized and dense, wove between structures that dwarfed Manhattan the way Manhattan dwarfed an anthill. Billions of lives packed into a single planetary surface, layered a kilometer deep in places, humming with energy and commerce and the machinery of galactic power. That, said Steve Rogers quietly, standing at the viewport with his shield on his arm and his jaw, doing the thing it did, when he was processing something he had no framework for, is not Earth. Astute observation, Captain, said Thor, who was the only one among them looking at the planet with something resembling recognition, not of the place, but of the scale. He had stood on Asgard. He understood civilizations that dwarf mountains. Still, even he was gripping Mjolnir a little tighter than usual. Bruce Banner was already at the sensor console, or trying to be. The Quinjet's instruments were throwing errors faster than he could dismiss them. The energy readings down there are extraordinary. There's something, I don't know how to describe it. It's like a field. Pervasive. Biological in origin, but it's everywhere. In everything. It's not radiation. It's not electromagnetic. It's alive, Natasha said. She wasn't looking at the instruments. She was looking at the planet. Whatever it is, it's alive. None of them had the vocabulary for the Force yet. That would come later. What came first were the ships. They emerged from the planet's shadow in tight Imperial formation, 2 Star Destroyers. Massive dagger-shaped vessels of grey durasteel, each one longer than a Manhattan City block stacked 17 times over, bristling with turbolaser batteries. That swung toward the Quinjet with the patient precision of apex predators that had never once needed to hurry. Between them, a swarm of TIE fighters poured from their hangars like hornets from a disturbed nest, twin ion engines screaming in the thin upper atmosphere. Company, Clint said from the pilot seat, hands already moving over controls he understood. Instinctively, even if nothing outside made sense. A lot of company. Very aggressive company. A comm channel crackled open. Imperial frequency. The universal translator built into Stark's suit scrambling to parse a language it had never encountered, and then, with Friday performing what Tony would later call the single most impressive piece of real-time linguistic processing in human, or apparently multidimensional, history, the words resolved into something they could understand. Unidentified vessel. You have entered restricted Imperial space above Coruscant. Cut your engines, lower your shields, and prepare to be boarded. Failure to comply will result in immediate destruction. This is your only warning. 6 Avengers looked at each other across the Quinjet's cramped interior. Coruscant, Bruce said softly, tasting the word. Population density down there must be in the trillions. They're powering weapons, Clint said flatly. Tony's faceplate snapped down. Right. Nobody shoot first. We are going to be diplomatic about this. He paused. Unless they shoot first, then we are going to be significantly less diplomatic. Cap's eyes were still on the planet below. 1 trillion lives. He didn't know who these people were, didn't know Empire from Republic, didn't know Palpatine from any other tyrant he'd fought, but he knew what 1 trillion lives looked like from orbit. It looked like something worth protecting. He didn't know yet that protection was about to be tested in ways none of them had survived before. He didn't know about the Grysk. No one above Coruscant did, not yet. But somewhere in the cold dark of the unknown regions, just beyond the edge of map space, a fleet was already moving. Enormous, patient, hungry, in the way only something that had devoured entire civilizations could be hungry. The Grysk hegemony had been watching the Empire for years, cataloguing its strength, mapping its weaknesses, waiting for the precise moment when its attention was divided, its resources stretched, its greatest weapon, fear, insufficient. They had chosen today. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. The first Grysk shadow fell across Coruscant's outer sensor grid at 0600 Imperial Standard Time. By 0610, every alarm on every Star Destroyer above the planet was screaming. By 0611, the Avengers were no longer the most dangerous thing in Imperial space. The Imperial Star Destroyer Relentless had survived the Battle of Atollon. It had hunted rebel cells across 3 sectors, had weathered ion storms in the Outer Rim, and had served as the command vessel of Admiral Cassius Constantine. Before his inglorious end at the hands of a rebel fleet he had underestimated. Its current commander, Admiral Veria Ossel, had not survived 20 years of Imperial service by underestimating anything. She was a precise woman, economical in her movements and her words, with the kind of cold intelligence that had carried her through a military that chewed through officers, the way a sarlacc chewed through bounty. Hunters, slowly, thoroughly, and without remorse. She had been preparing to have the strange grey vessel boarded and its occupants processed when the sensor officer made a sound she had never heard from a trained Imperial crew member before, a sound that was almost fear. Admiral. The young lieutenant's voice had lost its regulation steadiness entirely. Contacts. Unknown configuration. Emerging from. They're coming from the unknown regions vector, Admiral. Bearing 27 Mark 9. I'm reading. I can't get a count. The sensors are. He stopped. Started again. Admiral, I cannot get a count. Ossel crossed the bridge in 8 steps. Looked at the display. Said nothing for 4 full seconds. The contacts were not a fleet in any configuration she recognized. They moved in formations that Imperial tactical doctrine had no name for. Loose. Adaptive clusters that rippled and reformed. Like living organisms. Rather than military vessels. Each ship was vast, dark, angular in ways that seemed almost biological. As though something had grown durasteel around a skeleton of malice. No running lights. No transponder signals. No comm traffic on any frequency. They simply emerged from the dark between stars like a held breath finally released. And they kept coming, And coming. And the sensor count climbed past 40 and didn't stop. "Get me Grand Moff Tarkin," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. 20 years of practice. Now. Inside the Quinjet, Friday had been running continuous analysis on every signal she could intercept, and what she was assembling from. Fragmentary Imperial comm. Traffic was painting a picture that made Bruce Banner go very still, in the way he did when the other guy started paying attention. "Tony," Friday said, "the Imperial vessels have stopped targeting us." "I noticed," Tony said. He was outside the Quinjet now, hovering in the upper atmosphere on repulsor thrust, the Mark LS sensors sweeping in every direction. The TIE fighters that had been closing on them had broken off hard, banking back toward their star. Destroyers with the urgency of creatures that had just remembered something much more dangerous than their original target. What are they looking at? The answer came before Friday could respond. It came in the form of light, or rather, the absence of it. A darkness that moved against the stars with purpose, resolving itself as the Quinjet sensors recalibrated into shapes. That Tony's threat assessment. Protocols flagged instantly and unanimously as hostile. Not because of any specific weapon signature or attack pattern. Because of the way they moved. Patient. Coordinated. Inevitable. "Oh," Tony said quietly. "That's a lot of ships." Thor appeared beside him, Mjolnir in hand, lightning already, threading between his fingers with the reflexive readiness of a warrior who had spent 1,500 years recognizing the shape of an invasion. His blue eyes moved across the emerging fleet with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite or but contained elements of both. "These beings," he said slowly, "I do not know them, and there is very little in the 9 realms I do not know." Unknown region's origin, Friday supplied through the comm, designating them as Grysk hegemony based on fragmentary Imperial intelligence files I've intercepted and partially decrypted. Extragalactic in origin. No formal first contact on record with this civilization from Imperial archives, meaning either they've never met, or everyone who met them didn't survive to file a report. "Great," Clint said from inside the Quinjet. "Love those options." The first Grysk vessel opened fire without warning, without broadcast, without any of the ritualized communication that even the most brutal of Earth's conflicts had eventually developed. There was no declaration, no demand, no ultimatum transmitted across any frequency. There was simply a weapon, a directed energy pulse of a type Friday couldn't immediately classify, and it struck the relentless. Amidships with force enough to buckle 3 decks of durasteel and send a cascade of secondary explosions rolling along her port side. The Star Destroyer shuddered like a wounded animal and began to list. The second shot hit the planetary shield grid's primary relay station in Coruscant's upper atmosphere. The shield flickered. In the cityscape below, 1 trillion people looked up. Admiral Ossel's voice came across every Imperial frequency simultaneously, stripped of protocol and rank formality in a way that told Tony everything about how bad this was. "All vessels, all stations, this is not a drill. Coruscant is under attack. Repeat, Coruscant is under attack. Request immediate reinforcement from all available." The third Grysk pulse silenced the transmission. On the bridge of the Relentless, amid smoke and the screaming of damaged systems, a junior communications officer managed to re-establish a partial channel. The signal that came back wasn't Imperial. It was the Quinjet. Specifically, it was Steve Rogers, who had taken over the comm from Clint, because Steve's voice had a quality that cut through. Panic the way a klaxon cut through. Silence. Clear. Certain. Already decided. "This is Captain Steve Rogers. I don't know your chain of command, and right now I don't care. You have an invasion fleet at your door and your shields are failing. We can help. But I need someone with authority to talk to me in the next 60 seconds. Because after that we are acting unilaterally." Silence on the Imperial frequency. The kind of silence that meant someone was making a decision they hadn't been trained to make. Then, from a different channel entirely, cleaner, more direct, routed through what Friday identified as a command-level encryption. Protocol, a new voice. Not panicked, not young. The voice of a man who had survived every political catastrophe the galaxy had thrown at him, through the application of pure, unflinching calculated intelligence, and who had just recognized that they variables had changed enough to require an entirely new calculation. Grand Moff Wilhuff Tarkin, Captain Rogers. The name was unfamiliar in his mouth, but he used it with the precision of a man who wasted nothing, not even syllables. I am given to understand. You arrived through some form of dimensional anomaly and that your vessels' capabilities are extraordinary. I am also looking at 47 hostile warships, preparing a second salvo at my planet. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. I am prepared to be pragmatic. Are you? Steve looked at Tony. Tony looked at Natasha. Natasha looked at nobody in particular, which was how she looked when she was thinking fastest. One condition, Steve said. Name it. Civilian evacuation. Whatever transport capacity you have goes to. Getting people out of the impact zones. Non-negotiable. Another pause. Shorter this time. Tarkin was not a man who needed long to decide whether a concession cost him anything he couldn't afford to lose. Agreed. And Captain Rogers, do not mistake pragmatism for trust. When this is over, we will have a very different conversation. Understood, Steve said. Thor, you're up. Outside the Quinjet, the god of thunder looked at the incoming Grysk fleet with the focused calm of someone who had been doing this since before recorded human history, raised Mjolnir above his head, and called the lightning. Above Coruscant, the sky split open. The lightning came down in sheets, not the thin, branching kind that crackled between clouds on a stormy afternoon. This was Asgardian fury given physical form, the raw electrical output of a god who had once called a storm that darkened 3 counties of upstate New York and considered it a warm-up. It detonated against the lead Grysk warships, forward hull in a continuous cascade that overwhelmed whatever shielding technology the hegemony had developed across however many centuries of conquest, superheating the outer plating, fusing weapons arrays, and sending electromagnetic pulses cascading through the vessel's internal systems with the indiscriminate enthusiasm of a power surge, hitting an unprotected grid. The Grysk ship didn't explode. It was too large for that, too fundamentally constructed for violence to be undone by a single strike. But it listed hard, its formation-keeping thrusters blown, and the vessels behind it had to break their geometric assault pattern to avoid collision, and that break, that single disruption in the hegemony's otherwise flawless coordination, was the first mistake the Grysk had made since entering the system. The Avengers had built entire battle strategies on smaller openings. Friday, paint me targets, Tony said, and was already moving before the confirmation came back. The Mark LS repulsors, pushing him to speeds that made the TIE fighters still scrambling to reform their defensive screen look like they were standing still. He hit the second Grysk warship's weapons cluster from below, driving repulsor blasts into the joint between the primary cannon housing and the hull superstructure with the precision of a surgeon who happened to be traveling at 400 kilometers per hour. The cannon array tore free. The ship's next shot went wide, streaking past Coruscant's upper atmosphere and disappearing into deep space. 2 down from primary combat effectiveness, Friday reported. 45 remaining. Mr. Stark, I'm detecting something unusual in the Grysk formation. Several vessels are broadcasting on a frequency that doesn't match their own ship-to-ship communications. What frequency? It matches the biological signatures of the ships between them. Tony, some of those aren't Grysk vessels. He pulled up, hovering above the engagement, and looked at what Friday was showing him. and felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with altitude. Mixed into the Grysk fleet, identifiable now that Friday had flagged the energy differential, were ships of entirely different design, smaller, older, built with the aesthetic logic of civilizations that had their own histories, their own traditions, their own trajectories, before the Grysk hegemony had introduced them to a different kind of future. Client species vessels, conquered peoples, pressed into service as the leading edge of someone else's invasion, expendable and deliberately positioned where defensive fire would hit them first. Living shields, living weapons, beings who had no more chosen to be here than the civilians, sheltering in Coruscant's lower levels. Tony stared at the display for 2 seconds. In Tony Stark time, that was approximately long enough to run 17 contingency scenarios and hate every single one of them. Cap, he said. We have a problem. Steve heard the explanation at the same moment the Hulk hit the upper atmosphere. Bruce had made the call himself, quietly, without drama, setting down the datapad he'd been using to analyze Grysk energy signatures and simply saying, I think it's time before the change took him. What emerged from the Quinjet's rear hatch and dropped into the sky above Coruscant was not a scientific problem to be solved or a psychological condition to be managed. What emerged was the Hulk, and the Hulk looked at the fleet of ships that had come to hurt this city, this impossibly vast, impossibly populated city full of beings he'd never met and couldn't name, and arrived at the same conclusion he always arrived at when something large and dangerous threatened something smaller and less dangerous. He arrived at it with both fists. He hit the nearest Grysk warship's hull doing several hundred kilometers per hour, grabbed the leading edge of its forward deck with hands large enough to palm a sedan, and pulled. Durasteel designed to withstand the vacuum of space and the weapons of a galactic empire shrieked and buckled and tore, and the Hulk roared into the void with a sound that needed no translation and required no context and communicated with perfect clarity to every being in sensor range that something had changed about the nature of this engagement. On the bridge of the crippled Relentless, Admiral Ossel watched her tactical display with the expression of a woman renegotiating her understanding of the universe in real time. Admiral, said her tactical officer carefully, the green one just. I can see what the green one did, Lieutenant. Should we? We should focus on keeping this ship operational and let whatever those beings are continue doing. Whatever those beings are doing. She paused. And someone get me a damage report on decks 4 through 11. Natasha and Clint were operating at ground level. The first Grysk landing craft had broken through. During the chaos of the initial exchange, a deliberate probe, Tony would realize later, designed to test ground response while the main fleet absorbed the Avengers. Attention above. 6 craft, wedge-shaped and dark, punching through the weakened shield grid and descending into Coruscant's upper cityscape with the controlled precision of a military operation that had executed this exact maneuver on dozens of worlds before. They hit the Senate district first, because of course they did. Cut the political heart and the body follows. Natasha had requisitioned an Imperial speeder bike from a stormtrooper who had been too busy staring at the sky to notice her until the moment he was no longer standing. She moved through the Senate district's elevated walkways at speeds that would have unnerved most trained pilots, Clint riding behind her with a bow that had no business functioning as well as it did, in an alien city on the other side of a dimensional barrier, loosing arrows at Grysk ground troops, with the economy of a man who had learned a very long time ago not to waste shots. The Grysk ground forces were not what she'd expected. They were large, larger than humans, encased in armor that had a biological quality to it, as though it had been grown rather than manufactured. They moved with tactical intelligence that went beyond training, coordinating in patterns that felt almost telepathic in their smoothness. And they were preceded, always, by their client troops, beings from species she couldn't identify, armed with weapons that didn't match the Grysk aesthetic, fighting with the glazed coordination of people, operating under control they hadn't chosen. She took out 2 Grysk commanders in the first exchange. Precise shots, Black Widow's Widowmakers, targeting the command nodes she'd identified. In their armor configuration, from watching their troop movements for 40 seconds, the client troops faltered immediately. Without the Grysk coordination signal, they stumbled, looked at each other, looked at the weapons in their hands with expressions of profound confusion. They weren't soldiers. They were prisoners who'd been handed weapons. "Clint," she said quietly, not slowing the speeder, "we are not killing the client troops." "Already figured that out," he said. An arrow sang past her ear and took out a Grysk targeting system without touching the enslaved being, standing directly beside it, working on it. It was Bruce, still human at that point, who had identified the control mechanism. From the sensor data, a low frequency broadcast embedded in the Grysk command armor that functioned as a suppression signal, keeping client species compliant through a combination of technological and what they Imperial scientists would later theorize was force-adjacent neurological override. Disrupt the commanders, disrupt the signal, and the client troops were free. Free, disoriented, terrified, and standing in the middle of a battle on a planet they'd never chosen to invade. Natasha spent the next 20 minutes simultaneously fighting Grysk ground forces and shepherding confused, liberated client species beings away from the combat zone. Because that was the job, and the job had gotten complicated, and complicated was just another word for Tuesday, when you were a Black Widow. Above her, the battle raged across Coruscant sky. Below her, in the lower levels where the evacuation was still catastrophically incomplete, the sounds of the city were changing, the ordinary roar of a trillion lives going about their business replaced by something that had no name in any language but communicated perfectly across every species barrier. The sound of people who didn't know if they were going to survive the next hour. Steve Rogers heard it from 3 kilometers up, where he'd borrowed a damaged Imperial gunship and was personally directing the civilian corridor that Tarkin had, to his minimal credit, actually honored. He heard it and felt it the way he always felt it, the way he'd felt it since a skinny kid from Brooklyn had stood outside a movie theater listening to a newsreel about London during the Blitz and understood, without being told, that some things were simply not acceptable. He keyed his comm. "Tony, the lower levels. How bad?" Tony's response came back clipped and tight, which meant the answer was bad enough that Tony was rationing words. Grysk second wave just punched through levels 1 through 50. Civilian density down there is a pause. The kind that meant he'd run the numbers and didn't like them. It's bad. Capital. The Imperial evacuation transports can't reach the lower levels fast enough. The infrastructure is too damaged. Steve looked at the sky above him, at the ongoing battle, at the Grysk fleet still pressing its assault despite Thor and Tony and the Hulk carving through its forward elements, at the sheer mathematical impossibility of 6 people holding a line this long against an enemy this patient and this large. Then he looked at the comm in his hand, at the frequency locked to Tarkin's command channel. He thought about what Natasha had told him about the client troops, about beings pressed into service they hadn't chosen, weaponized by a power that cared nothing for them as individuals. He thought about a galactic empire that ruled through fear and enforced through violence, and had nonetheless just committed its evacuation transports to saving civilian lives, because Steve had asked and Tarkin had calculated that compliance cost him nothing he needed right now. He thought about the choice sitting in front of him like a loaded weapon. And then Tony's voice came back on the comm, quieter now, stripped of its usual defensive sarcasm. "Capital, I need to tell you something about the Grysk fleet's next move, and you're not going to like it." What Tony had found was elegant, in the way that only truly terrible things manage to be elegant. The Grysk fleet's second wave wasn't coming from the unknown region's vector. It was already here, had been here, folded into the sensor shadow of Coruscant's own moon, sitting in perfect stillness while the first wave absorbed the Avengers' attention and mapped their capabilities with the patient thoroughness of a predator that had been doing this long enough to have made an art form of it. 40 additional vessels, heavier than the first wave, configured not for ship-to-ship combat but for something that Friday's partially decrypted Grysk intelligence files identified with a designation that translated approximately as Civilization Termination Protocol. Not conquest, erasure. The Grysk hegemony, it turned out, did not always want what was on a planet. Sometimes they simply wanted the planet removed from the equation, resources denied to rivals, populations eliminated before they could become resistance, entire civilizations unmade with the administrative efficiency of a civilization that had been doing this for a very long time and had developed strong opinions about thoroughness. Coruscant, with its trillion inhabitants, its imperial seat of power, its centuries of accumulated galactic infrastructure. Coruscant was not a prize the Grysk wanted to capture. It was a statement they wanted to make. Tony relayed all of this in 63 seconds of flat, precise language, standing in the upper atmosphere with the Mark LS systems, working at maximum capacity, and Friday running continuous projections that all ended in the same place. When he finished, there was silence on the comm channel for long enough that he counted it. 7 seconds. That was how long it took Steve Rogers to process the end of a trillion lives and arrive at a response. Tarkin needs to know, Steve said. All of it. Cap. He has resources we don't. Ships, weapons, personnel. If we keep this between us and fail, everyone down there dies anyway. A pause. And Tony, I need you to be honest with me. Can we stop the second wave? Tony looked at his display. At 40 heavy Grysk vessels beginning to emerge from lunar shadow with the slow, inexorable patience of something that had never once needed to hurry. At his own power readings. Arc reactor at 91% and climbing as Friday's recalibration worked through its final sequences, but 91% of iron. Man against 40 civilization termination. Vessels was a number he could do the math on very quickly. At Thor, who had been calling lightning for 40 minutes straight and whose strikes were still devastating but marginally slower between salvos. At the Hulk, who was limitless in theory but was currently embedded 3 decks deep in a Grysk warship and working his way out. At Natasha and Clint, who were 2 human beings with extraordinary skills operating in the lower levels of a city underground, assault and doing the quiet, brutal, necessary work that nobody above would see or count. Honestly, Tony said, not alone. Tarkin received the intelligence, with the stillness, of a man whose entire career had been built on processing catastrophic information without allowing it to show on his face. He stood at the relentless command holotable. The ship had been partially stabilized, 3 of its 4 reactor cores still functional, and looked at the second wave's projected approach vector with eyes that gave away precisely nothing. Around him, his senior staff waited. They were Imperial officers, trained to follow orders and project confidence and never, under any circumstances, allow subordinates to see uncertainty in command. Every one of them was looking at the holotable with the controlled expression of people who were very, very frightened. Captain Rogers, Tarkin said finally, addressing the comm with the same crisp precision he used for everything, because Tarkin was the kind of man who maintained crisp precision the way other men maintain heartbeats, automatically, unconsciously, because stopping meant dying. You are telling me that the first wave was a measurement, that they have been cataloging your capabilities and mine for the past 40 minutes. That's what the data suggests, Steve said. And the second wave is configured for planetary destruction. Yes. A silence. The kind Tarkin used when he was not deciding. He had already decided. In the 3 seconds after, Steve finished speaking, but performing the ritual of consideration. That leadership required. What do you need? Steve told him. What he needed was everything. Every star. Destroyer in the Coruscant system. For more had arrived during the engagement, drawn by the emergency beacon. Ussel had managed to transmit before the Grysk jamming thickened. Every TIE squadron. Every ground installation still capable of orbital fire support. Coordinated, unified, operating under a single tactical framework that Tony would provide and Friday would distribute across Imperial command networks in real time. What he needed, in short, was for the Galactic Empire to follow the orders of a man in a star-spangled uniform from a planet that wasn't in any of their charts. Tarkin agreed. Not out of respect. Not out of admiration. Out of the same cold calculus that had driven every decision of his career. The variables had changed. The optimal outcome required a specific input. And personal pride was a luxury that the Grand Moff of the Outer Rim could not afford at this particular moment. He agreed the way a glacier moves, without warmth, without hesitation, with the absolute certainty of mass and momentum. One condition, he said, and Steve almost smiled because he recognized the echo. Name it. When this engagement concludes, you and your people will submit to Imperial custody for debriefing. Voluntarily. You will answer questions about your origin, your capabilities, and your technology, after which disposition of your persons will be determined by Imperial law. Steve looked at Tony through the faceplate. Tony looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Steve said. It was not an agreement. Tarkin noted this precisely and said nothing, because the second wave was 20 minutes from firing. Range and noted in precision was not the same as actionable defiance. There would be time. The fracture came from inside, as fractures always did. Tony had been quiet since the tactical framework went out across Imperial channels, quieter than the situation strictly required, operating his part of the plan with mechanical efficiency while something worked itself out behind. His eyes that hadn't resolved yet. Natasha noticed it the way she noticed everything, peripherally, catalogued, filed for later. Clint noticed it because he'd known Tony long enough to recognize the specific quality of his silences. Steve noticed it and gave him space because Steve had learned, slowly and at some cost, that Tony Stark worked through his hardest thinking by doing, and interrupting the doing interrupted the thinking. It was Bruce who finally asked, still human, back aboard the partially repaired Quinjet, monitoring Friday's tactical feed and coordinating the data flow to Imperial Command. Tony, what is it? Not a question. Bruce Banner had a specific talent for identifying the shape of a problem before its name became available. Tony's response came after 4 seconds. The second wave civilization termination protocol. Friday finished decrypting the full technical breakdown 20 minutes ago. And it's not a weapon. Not exactly. He pulled up the schematics, shared them to Bruce's console, to Steve's comm, to Natasha's wrist display. It's a cascade initiator. It triggers a chain reaction in a planet's existing energy infrastructure. For a normal planet, manageable. For Coruscant, he stopped. Coruscant runs almost entirely on a planetary reactor grid. The deepest levels are basically one continuous power generation system. If the GRYSKS trigger the cascade, the reactor grid amplifies it. They don't need to destroy the planet themselves. The planet destroys itself. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. How do you stop it? Steve asked. You'd need to shut down the planetary reactor grid entirely before the cascade initiates. Full shutdown. Every level. Tony paused. Coruscant goes dark. No power. No life support systems in the lower levels. No heating in the upper atmosphere processing plants. No medical systems. No. How many people die in a full shutdown? Natasha asked. Her voice was exactly level. Friday's best estimate. Another pause. The worst kind. the kind where someone was deciding how to say a number. Between 8 and 12 million. Lower-level residents dependent on powered life support. Medical facilities. Atmospheric processes for the deep city sections. He stopped. Versus 1 trillion if the cascade initiates. Nobody spoke. The math was not complicated. The math was the simplest math any of them had ever encountered. And the most impossible thing any of them had ever been asked to do. 8 million lives to save 1 trillion. The arithmetic of catastrophe. The equation that had no right answer and demanded one anyway. There's a third option, Tony said. And his voice had gone to a place that Steve recognized, the place Tony went when he'd already decided and was telling them after the fact because their decision was his to make and he'd known it from the moment Friday finished the decryption. The cascade needs a planetary scale trigger. Something that hits the reactor grid simultaneously at multiple nodes. If something disrupted the trigger signal before it could propagate. Tony, Steve said carefully, a sufficiently powerful electromagnetic pulse, generated at the cascade's initiation point, collapses the trigger signal before it reaches critical propagation threshold. He paused. The arc reactor can generate that pulse at full discharge. Full discharge, Bruce said quietly. Leaves the suit dead. Leaves me in unpowered armor in the middle of a combat zone. But the cascade doesn't initiate. The reactor grid stays online. Life support stays up. Nobody in the lower levels. Tony. Steve's voice was firm now, the voice that cut through noise. There are other options we haven't. I've run them. Capital Friday's run them. This is the one that works and doesn't cost 8 million lives. A pause. Something shifted in his voice. Not softer exactly, but less armored. I've done this before. Remember? Big, dark, wormhole, nuke. I came back from that one. You nearly didn't. Nearly is the operative word. The second wave was 14 minutes from firing range. The Grysk formation had completed its emergence from lunar shadow and was moving with the slow, absolute confidence of something that had never encountered a problem it couldn't solve through sufficient application of firepower and patience. Thor was already repositioning to meet the vanguard, lightning crackling between his fingers with a fury that had been building for an hour and was now looking for a proportionate target. The Hulk had torn free of the first wave vessel and was crossing open space in great, bounding leaps between debris fields, aiming himself at the second wave's leading edge with a single-minded focus of a gamma-powered freight train. They would slow the second wave. They would damage it, disrupt it, carve through it with everything they had. But they would not stop the cascade trigger. That was a technical problem, not a strength problem. And the universe was completely indifferent to how hard you could hit something, if hitting it wasn't what the situation required. Steve Rogers stood in borrowed Imperial armor on the deck of the Relentless, looking at a tactical display that showed him the shape of the next 12 minutes, and felt the specific weight of a decision he didn't have the right to make for someone else pressing against him from all sides. It's your call, he said finally. Because it was. Because that was the only honest thing to say. It's always been your call. Tony was quiet for 3 seconds. Tell Thor to keep them busy, he said. I need to get to the cascade. Initiation point before the second wave. Enters firing range. Friday has the coordinates. A beat. And cap. If this goes sideways. It won't. But if it does. Steve closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Opened them. Then we finish it. Whatever it takes. Yeah, Tony said. And his voice, for just that moment, sounded less like Iron Man and more like the man underneath. That's what I figured. The Mark L turned in the upper atmosphere of Coruscant and flew toward the coordinates. Friday had identified a specific node in the planetary reactor grid, deep in the city's infrastructure, where the Grysk cascade trigger would first make contact with Coruscant's power network and either be stopped or not be stopped, and there Difference between those two outcomes was difference between a tragedy and an extinction. Above him, Thor called down the fury of the storm. Below him, 1,000,000,000,000 people waited without knowing they were waiting. The storm Thor called was not like any storm Coruscant had ever recorded. The planet had weather control systems, vast atmospheric processes embedded in the upper cityscape that had managed Coruscant's climate for centuries, smoothing out the chaos of natural meteorology into something predictable and manageable, and entirely unlike what was currently happening above the Senate District. What was currently happening above the Senate District was an Asgardian, declaring his intentions to the universe in the only language he had ever truly been fluent in, which was the language of lightning and thunder and the absolute refusal to allow something larger than himself to win simply because it was larger. He hit the second wave's vanguard alone and at full speed. Mjolnir moved faster than TIE fighters, faster than turbolaser bolts. It struck the lead Grysk heavy warship's primary weapons array with force enough to register on Coruscant's seismic sensors 600 kilometers below, tore through the array entirely, and returned to Thor's hand trailing molten metal, and the smell of ozone thick, enough to taste. He was already spinning it again before the first shockwave finished propagating, calling the lightning down in continuous chains that leaped from warship to warship, through the conductive medium of their own hull material, turning their geometric formation into a liability. The closer they held their positions, the more efficiently the current traveled between them. They broke formation. That was what he needed. A fleet in formation was a weapon. A fleet that had broken formation was a collection of individual problems. And Thor had been solving individual problems since before the Roman Empire had its first good idea. The Hulk arrived 11 seconds later and began solving individual problems in a completely different and significantly louder manner. The Imperial Star Destroyers held the flanks, 4 of them now fully operational, their turbolaser batteries firing in the coordinated patterns Tony's tactical framework had established, targeting the Grysk vessels, identified weak points, with an accuracy that Grand Moff Tarkin's tactical staff would later describe, in the clipped language of people determined not to sound impressed, as adequate. The TIE squadrons wove between the engagement's larger elements, targeting Grysk fighter craft that had begun deploying from the heavy warships, smaller vessels, faster than the main fleet, designed to overwhelm defensive screens through sheer numbers. Clint Barton, operating from the stabilized upper deck of a damaged Imperial gunship that Natasha had commandeered during the ground engagement's third phase, was having what he would subsequently describe to no one in particular as genuinely the most absurd afternoon of my life. Shooting arrows at spacecraft in the upper atmosphere of an alien planet while a Norse god called lightning 3 kilometers to his left. He was also, by any objective measure, being extraordinarily effective at it. The custom EMP arrows Tony had built him 2 years ago for a Hydra operation in Minsk turned out to be equally persuasive against Grysk fighter targeting systems, which operated on principles different from anything on Earth but were still, at their core, electronics, and electronics had a consistent relationship with sufficiently focused electromagnetic disruption regardless of which side of a dimensional barrier they'd been manufactured on. Natasha was below, still moving, because Natasha was always still moving. The ground assault had fractured when she and Clint had systematically eliminated the Grysk command structure in the Senate District, 14 commanders in 38 minutes, each one identified through behavioral pattern analysis, each elimination cascading through the client troops, control signal and releasing another cluster of bewildered, frightened beings from neurological override. She was now coordinating with what she had identified as the most competent remaining Imperial ground officer, a young lieutenant named Kavar, who had the specific quality of controlled adaptability that Natasha associated with people who were going to either be extraordinary or dead before they turned 40, moving liberated client species, civilians through the Senate districts, maintenance corridors toward the Imperial, evacuation transports. She was also listening to Tony's comm feed. The reactor node was in level 1247. Coruscant's cityscape, descended in layers, upper levels, gleaming and affluent and touched by whatever passed for sunlight after it, filtered through the atmospheric processes, lower levels progressively darker and older and more densely packed, until you reached the deep city where the original planetary surface had been so thoroughly buried under centuries of construction that the concept of sky was purely theoretical, and the only light came from the infrastructure itself. Level 1247 was old enough that the construction aesthetic had shifted entirely. No Imperial grey, no Republic white, just the dark pragmatic architecture of people who had built something meant to last, and had achieved that goal so completely that it had outlasted everyone who remembered building it. Tony flew through it at speeds that required Friday to manage collision avoidance, because the tunnels were not designed for anything moving this fast. The Mark LS repulsors painting the ancient walls in shifting blue light. Every sensor array the suit possessed oriented toward the coordinates where Friday's decryption indicated the cascade trigger would make first contact with the grid. He had 9 minutes. Talk to me, Friday. Cascade initiation point is a primary junction node where 17 major reactor tributaries converge. The GRYSK trigger signal, when it arrives, will simultaneously activate a resonance frequency across all 17. The reactor grid amplifies the resonance. Amplification reaches critical threshold in approximately 4 minutes after initiation. A pause. The arc reactor pulse needs to be generated at this exact node to collapse the trigger signal across all 17 tributaries simultaneously. Partial coverage is insufficient. I know. Tony. Friday's voice did something it very rarely did, which was step outside the parameters of tactical information delivery. The full discharge will also affect your suit's life support systems. The lower levels have no breathable atmosphere processing in several adjacent sections. I want you to have complete information. Tony flew in silence for 4 seconds. I always want complete information, he said. That's why I built you. He broke through into the junction node chamber and stopped. It was vast, cathedral vast, the kind of space that existed in the deep city because something had needed to be large enough to contain the infrastructure of a planet, and no one had ever bothered to make it beautiful because no one important was ever supposed to see it. 17 reactor tributaries converged here in a web of conduit and energy transfer systems that pulsed with the slow rhythm of a planetary heartbeat, casting everything in deep amber light that made the ancient durasteel walls look almost warm. The hum was subsonic, felt in the chest rather than heard. The accumulated vibration of 1 trillion lives worth of power generation singing through the bones of a world. Tony landed in the center of it. Stood there for a moment. Pepper's going to be so angry, he said quietly. To no one, or possibly to Friday, or possibly to the universe in general, which had a long history of putting him in positions that Pepper Potts would subsequently and correctly identify as entirely avoidable. Mr. Stark, Friday said. 6 minutes to cascade initiation. Yeah. He looked at the junction node, at the specific convergence point his sensors had identified, the precise location where the pulse needed to originate, to achieve full tributary coverage. Step toward it. Friday. After the discharge. Full system reboot sequence. Everything you can manage on emergency power. Already prepared. And Friday. He stopped. Considered. You did good. With the translation. With the decryption. With all of it. I don't say that enough. You say it enough, Friday said, which was not true but was the right thing to say. He placed both hands on the junction node. Above him, 600 layers of city and then open sky and then the battle. Thor holding the line with everything he had, the Hulk tearing through Grysk heavy armor with the focused fury of a being who understood on some fundamental level that the size of the obstacle was irrelevant, Clint and his absurd arrows and his complete refusal to be anything less than exactly as effective as the situation required, Natasha moving through the deep city's maintenance corridors with liberated beings and a lieutenant who was going to be either extraordinary or dead, Steve Rogers standing on the deck of a star destroyer that belonged to a government he didn't believe in, directing a battle to save a world he'd arrived at by accident, because that was what Steve Rogers did. He stood in the place that needed standing in and he held it. 4 minutes. Tony thought about New York, about a portal and a nuclear weapon and the cold dark of space and the very specific quality of the silence just before the suit's power had given out the first time. He thought about how he'd felt then. Not afraid, exactly. More like completed. Like something had been asked of him and he'd answered it, and whatever came after was secondary to the fact of the answer. He thought about the trillion people above him who would never know this happened. He thought about 8 million people in the lower levels who would never know they'd been saved. He thought, that's enough. That's always been enough. Friday, he said. Full discharge. Now. The arc reactor pulse was not visible in any conventional sense. It didn't look like anything. It was energy, a precisely calibrated electromagnetic cascade that propagated outward from Tony's chest through both arms and into the junction node and from there along 17 reactor tributaries simultaneously, traveling at the speed of electricity through infrastructure designed to carry it, reaching every point of potential cascade initiation in the same instant and collapsing the Grysk trigger frequency before it could find purchase in the grid. It was completely silent. And then the Mark L went dark, and Tony Stark stood in the deep city of Coruscant in unpowered armor in ambient amber light, listening to the planetary heartbeat continue, steady, unbroken, unchanged, and understood that it had worked. He sat down on the ancient Durasteel floor. Waited. Friday. Silence. The silence of systems rebooting. Of emergency power threading its way back through fried circuits. Of an AI reassembling herself from the parts that had survived. Then, reboot sequence at 43%. Life support nominal in this section. Mr. Stark. The cascade trigger signal. Reached the grid boundary and collapsed. Full coverage achieved. A pause. You did it. We did it, Tony said. Above him, the battle was ending. The second wave, deprived of its civilization termination capability, had lost its strategic purpose, and the Grysk hegemony, whatever else it was not an organization that spent resources on engagements that had ceased to offer return on investment. The withdrawal was as coordinated as the arrival. The heavy warships pulling back toward the unknown. Region's vector with the unhurried. Efficiency of something that was not. Retreating so much as deferring. They left their damaged vessels. Behind, the first waves. Casualties still drifting in Coruscant. Orbital space. Gutted and dark. They left their client species troops behind. Scattered through the Senate district in. Various states of disorientation. And liberation. They left, and they did not look back. Because the Grysk hegemony had no cultural framework for looking back. They had catalogued the new variables. They would recalculate. They would return. But not today. Thor landed on the relentless forward deck and sat down heavily. Mjolnir resting across his knees. And looked at the retreating fleet with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion. And relief and the particular satisfaction. Of a warrior who has held a line that needed holding. The Hulk, drifting in orbital space among the debris of Grysk warships, slowly became Bruce Banner again, a process that left him floating in zero gravity in torn trousers, which was undignified but alive, which was the important part. Clint lowered his bow. Natasha, in the maintenance corridors of the deep city, found a wall and put her back against it and breathed. And Steve Rogers stood on the bridge of an Imperial Star Destroyer and watched the enemy withdraw and felt none of the things he usually felt after a battle was won, because winning this one had required standing beside the Galactic Empire. And the Galactic Empire was still there, and Tarkin was already walking toward him with the specific expression of a man who had agreed to postpone a conversation, and was now prepared to resume it. Captain Rogers, Tarkin said. A word. Steve turned to face him. Straightened. Shield on his arm, chin level, eyes clear. Every centimeter the thing he was, not a soldier, not an Imperial, not a rebel, not anything this galaxy had a category for, something older than any of those categories, and more stubborn than all of them combined. I heard you, Steve said. About custody. About debriefing. He met Tarkin's eyes without looking away. We are not doing that. Tarkin's expression didn't change. You made an implicit agreement. I said we'd cross that bridge. We crossed it. Steve's voice was level and final. You have your planet, Grand Moff. You have your trillion lives. What you don't have is us. He paused. I'd call that a fair trade. Something moved behind Tarkin's eyes that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite fury and landed somewhere between them in a territory that had no clean name. He stood very still for 4 seconds. You'll find, he said finally, that the Empire has a long memory. So do I, Steve said. They found Tony in level 1247, sitting on the floor of a reactor junction chamber in a dead suit of armor, listening to a planet breathe. Thor carried him up, through 600 layers of city, because the repulsors weren't working. Yet, and Tony wasn't going to argue with that particular solution. And when they emerged into the upper atmosphere, and the light hit the Mark LS, damaged plating and the city spread out below them for as far as any of them could see, vast and luminous and entirely, improbably alive. Nobody said anything for a long moment. There were a trillion people down there who would never know what had happened in the deep city today, who would file it under the battle and remember the lightning and the green giant and the strange armored beings who had fought in Coruscant sky, and who would not know that the battle above had been the distraction and the real fight had been 600 levels below in amber light and silence. That was fine. That had always been fine. The work didn't require an audience. What the GOSKS had come for, they hadn't gotten. What they'd revealed, that something existed beyond the unknown regions, patient enough and powerful enough to attempt the erasure of a civilization as vast as the Empire that would ripple through Imperial intelligence for years, through Rebel alliance planning, through every faction that operated in the knowledge that they galaxy's edge was not an ending but a border, and borders implied something on the other side, and somewhere in the unknown regions, in the cold dark between stars, the GOSK hegemony was already recalculating, already identifying the new variable, already adding 6 names to the list of things that required a different approach. The Avengers had saved Coruscant. They had done it with 6 people and stubbornness and an AI who gave good tactical advice and a god who refused to stop swinging. They had done it alongside an empire they didn't believe in, for a population that didn't know them, on a world they'd arrived at by accident. They had done it because it was the right thing to do, because a trillion lives didn't become negotiable simply because the zip code was unfamiliar. Now they floated above it all, 6 people from a world that wasn't on any Star Wars chart, in a galaxy that had no word for Avenger yet, and the Force, that ancient and invisible current that bound all living things, moved through the moment the way it moved through all moments, feeling something new that it had no category for either, and decided, in whatever way the Force decided things, that it was worth watching. In the unknown regions, the GRYSKS plotted. In the Imperial Palace, Tarkin wrote a report that would reach the Emperor's desk within the hour. And in the deep city, the planetary heart beat on. May the Force be with you.